You know that feeling, right? Like that low-level um, ambient hum of anxiety that kicks in when you casually check your retirement account balance.
Oh, yeah, and suddenly your chest gets just a little tight.
Exactly. Or, when you read a headline about inflation or interest rates or like tech layoffs.
Right, you get that creeping sensation that the solid ground you thought you were standing on might actually be more like a rug.
A rug that someone is slowly pulling out from under you.
Yeah, we've all been there. I mean, it's a nearly universal hallmark of modern life right now.
It really is. We are living in an era entirely defined by economic anxiety. And it cuts across almost every demographic, every tax bracket.
Yeah, we carry this shared psychological burden around with us, mostly because the systems we were told would protect us seem to be constantly fracturing.
People are looking around at fluctuating markets and struggling institutions and asking a very fundamental question, like, where is your financial security actually rooted? And that exact vulnerability, that central question, is really the launching pad for our deep dive today. We are looking at a really fascinating piece of source material.
Yeah, it's a short, faith-based text, a spiritual reflection, really.
Right, and it tackles the concept of financial security head-on. So our mission today is to unpack how this specific text contrasts the unreliability of our modern financial institutions with, well, ancient spiritual wisdom regarding provision.
The author draws a very sharp, uncompromising line between the temporary nature of human economic systems and what they describe as the enduring nature of divine provision.
It's a super compelling dichotomy. But before we get into the weeds, I want to be super clear with you, our listener, because our source material is inherently religious.
Right. It quotes the Bible extensively. It discusses God's provision.
Exactly. So we want to state up front that our goal today is not to endorse a specific theology. We're not here to preach or, take a religious stance.
No, not at all.
We're here to impartially explore the really fascinating philosophical and psychological arguments this text presents. I mean, we're looking at what it says about the human condition, our nervous systems, and where we place our ultimate trust.
Because when external structures fail, what is holding you up? It's a profound psychological question, completely regardless of your personal belief system.
Totally. So to understand the alternative solution this author is offering, we first have to fully grasp the specific crisis they're describing.
And the source material paints a remarkably bleak, but honestly highly recognizable picture of the modern financial landscape.
Yeah, there's zero sugarcoating. I mean, the author details failing banks, crumbling investment giants, and shrinking multinational corporations.
Right, and we see swelling queues of the underemployed and the unemployed.
But there is a specific phrase used to describe the psychological fallout that really stuck with me. They call it an epidemic of fear.
An epidemic of fear. Yeah.
And it's plaguing the hearts of those who are actually currently employed. Because, just because you have a job doesn't mean you aren't terrified of losing it tomorrow.
That phrase captures the modern zeitgeist perfectly. The author is basically diagnosing a societal illness. The fear isn't just a byproduct of the system, it has become the defining characteristic of participating in the system.
Wow, yeah.
And the source goes further by highlighting how this crisis fractures along demographic lines. It points out that the experience of this financial dread looks very different depending on where you are in your life.
Like, think about the young professional today. The traditional narrative we've pushed for decades. You graduate, you feel a sense of accomplishment, you buy a house, you start your life.
That is completely broken.
It is. Instead, the joy of graduation is immediately crushed by the stress of massive university debts and a shrinking, hyper-competitive job market. You're starting a marathon with a 100-pound weight strapped to your back.
And on the other end of the generational spectrum, the picture isn't much brighter. For older individuals, the long-held dreams of a peaceful retirement are evaporating.
Yeah.
They are being replaced by a grim new reality that the author bluntly calls work till you drop.
Work till you drop. It's incredibly bleak.
It is. The societal promise of a restful final chapter, like a reward for decades of labor, has effectively been rescinded by macroeconomic forces entirely beyond their control.
Which perfectly sets up a brilliant moment in the source material where the author calls out the sheer absurdity of corporate messaging in the face of all this real-world suffering.
Right. There is a mention of an insurance company that advertises itself as The Rock.
Yeah, claiming to be the unshakable foundation of your financial security. The author asks us to reflect on that. Do we actually trust those corporate slogans anymore?
The disillusionment is palpable. I mean, the public has experienced a collective loss of innocence regarding these institutions.
Absolutely. We watched massive historic banks vanish overnight during financial crises. We've seen too big to fail, fail.
Right.
Trusting these old corporate slogans today feels like um, leaning against a Hollywood prop wall.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right, because from the front, it looks like solid brick. It looks like a fortress, a bank, an impenetrable rock. But the second you put any actual weight on it, the second a global crisis hits and you need that institution to hold you up, it topples over.
Because there's nothing behind it but a few wooden 2x4s and some sandbags.
Exactly. Looking at this fragile landscape, the author asks, where can we turn? To politicians, to the government, to the next get-rich-quick guru on social media.
And the underlying argument is that turning to those human avenues is ultimately a futile exercise, not just because they are currently mismanaged, but because they are fundamentally flawed by their very nature. They are temporary.
Right.
This is where the source material pivots from diagnosing the modern crisis to introducing ancient wisdom to explain the underlying mechanics of why these modern safety nets continually fail us.
The author actually points to a specific ancient proverb to explain this failure. It's Proverbs chapter 27, verse 24.
Let's hear it.
It says, riches do not endure forever, and a crown is not secure for all generations. And I found it fascinating that the author explicitly interprets the word crown here to mean human government and human economic systems.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because equating the crown to human government changes our entire perspective on reliance.
How so?
Well, we are constantly pressured to build our lives around systems that require immense faith. Take fiat currency, for example. We trade our time, our energy, our literal lives for digital number or pieces of paper that hold value purely because a crown promises they have value.
Right, they aren't backed by physical gold or tangible assets anymore.
Exactly. They are backed by collective belief in a temporary human institution.
Okay, let's unpack this further. If we accept the premise that human systems, whether that is a literal monarchy, a modern democracy, a fiat currency, or a massive global banking network, are inherently designed with an expiration date.
Yeah. Isn't relying on them for our ultimate security a guaranteed setup for failure? It's like signing a 100-year lease on an office building that is already scheduled for demolition. You are asking for permanence from a structure that is, by definition, impermanent.
That category error is exactly what the author is highlighting. We are asking a crown to provide eternal security. It simply cannot do that. It was never built to endure forever.
Wow.
So the anxiety you feel in your chest when you check your shrinking portfolio isn't just an economic reaction. According to this philosophy, it is a spiritual and psychological warning sign that your foundational security is built on sand. The crown will inevitably fall, shift, or be replaced.
So since human governments and financial institutions aren't the answer, the author introduces a radical alternative. They throw down this incredibly audacious claim: there is no financial crisis in his kingdom. It establishes a complete, non-negotiable dichotomy between the failing, anxiety-ridden worldly economy and what they present as a flawless, anxiety-free divine economy.
And to prevent this from remaining like an abstract theological concept, the author immediately provides a series of historical and biblical case studies.
Right. These are presented as archetypes of divine provision to prove the point that this alternative economy actually functions in reality.
The list is really fascinating. It mentions the ancient Israelites wandering in a barren desert, facing starvation, and receiving fresh manna falling from the sky.
And water pouring out of a solid rock.
Yes. It brings up the prophet Elijah being physically brought food by ravens during a severe regional famine. It references a destitute widow who was preparing her final meal, only to have her tiny supply of oil and flour miraculously multiplied to sustain her family indefinitely.
And finally, it points to the famous story of a young boy's lunch, just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish being utilized to feed an entire crowd of thousands.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Look closely at the pattern across every single one of those examples.
Yeah.
Manna. Ravens dropping a meal. A little bit of oil in a jar. A kid's packed lunch.
Yeah.
What is glaringly absent from this list?
Massive wealth accumulation.
Exactly. Nobody in these ancient stories gets a sudden influx of cash. Nobody wins the ancient lottery or is handed the deed to a massive estate. These stories are exclusively about immediate, highly practical sustenance during times of absolute dire scarcity.
The author is deliberately choosing case studies that entirely bypass traditional economic rules. In the worldly economy, security is synonymous with hoarding resources.
Right, you stockpile money in a retirement account so you don't have to work till you drop.
Exactly. You build a fortress of assets to insulate yourself from the epidemic of fear. But in the divine economy, as presented through these archetypes, security is redefined. It means having exactly what you need, exactly when you need it, provided directly by the source.
It is the ultimate just-in-time supply chain. But instead of relying on global shipping logistics, it relies on miraculous intervention.
The psychological shift required to accept that is massive, and the author grounds this idea with second quote from Proverbs chapter 27, verses 26 and 27.
What does that one say?
It envisions a life where the lambs will provide you with clothing, and the goats with the price of a field. You will have plenty to feed your family.
Lambs for clothes, goats to buy a field. It is incredibly practical and earthy.
Oh.
We're talking about golden chariots or immense luxury. We're talking about fundamental human needs being met.
It illustrates a vision of sustained provision that comes directly from nature, from the earth, and ultimately from a divine source, rather than being mediated by a bank or an investment firm.
Yeah.
The psychological mechanism here is profound. If your security is tied directly to the earth and a divine promise, you are insulated from the fluctuating interest rates of the crown. You are removed from the rat race.
Which sounds incredibly peaceful in theory. But reading this, I kept hitting a wall when it came to application. Like, how do we actually transition out of the failing human systems and into this divine economy?
Because we can't all wander out into the desert and wait for bread to fall from the sky.
Exactly. The source material attempts to move from the abstract to the practical by introducing a mindset shift with a reflection question posed by God in the book of Jeremiah. Is anything too difficult for me?
And that rhetorical question demands a resounding no.
Right.
From that foundational premise that nothing is too difficult for the divine, the text outlines 3 specific actionable steps for the reader to enter into this new economic paradigm. Number 1, trust God to provide for you. Number 2, do what he tells you to do. And number 3, believe that God will provide.
So what does this all mean in practice? I have to push back here because steps 1 and 3, trusting and believing, those are internal postures. They're mental states.
Yeah, they are.
But step 2 is an action, do what he tells you to do. Wait, believe and he will provide. That can sound incredibly passive to a modern reader, like sitting on your couch waiting for a flock of ravens to drop a sandwich through the window.
Right.
How does doing what he tells you not just lead to fatalism? What does that actually look like for someone facing a foreclosure notice tomorrow?
That is the most critical tension in the entire text. This philosophy is not advocating for fatalism, passivity, or laziness.
Okay.
Doing what he tells you to do requires intense, active listening and, crucially, active obedience with the resources you currently possess. Think back to the widow with the oil and flour.
Yeah, she was down to her last meal.
Exactly. Her miraculous provision didn't happen while she was sitting around doing nothing. It occurred after she was obedient and willing to share the tiny, seemingly insufficient amount of food she had left.
Oh, I see. The action itself is the conduit for the provision.
Yeah.
You don't just wait for the outcome, you participate in the process, even if the action seems economically illogical in the moment.
Right. We see this mechanism synthesized beautifully in a prayer at the very end of the source material. The prayer contrasts the deeply uncertain worldly economy with what it calls your economy, God's economy. It advocates for a total paradigm shift regarding how we view our possessions. Listen to the core line from this prayer. We dedicate all our resources to you, and we pray that we will use them for the glory of you and your kingdom.
We dedicate all our resources to you. That is the psychological crux of this entire deep dive.
Yes.
That means it is no longer my bank account, my house, my career. I am relinquishing ownership.
By dedicating all resources back to the divine, you undergo a fundamental psychological shift from owner to steward or manager.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Think of it like being a property manager instead of the homeowner. If the roof of a house caves in, the property manager has a job to do. They have to call the roofer, handle the logistics, and manage the repair.
Right.
But the ultimate financial burden, the existential threat of paying for it, that falls on the owner. The nervous system of the property manager doesn't register the same level of terror as the owner whose net worth is tied up in the house.
Oh, that analogy makes perfect sense. If I view myself as the absolute owner of my resources, a market crash threatens my identity and my survival.
Yeah.
It triggers that epidemic of fear we talked about.
Exactly.
But if I am just managing resources for a higher power, a market crash is an administrative problem for the owner. It is not an existential threat to the manager.
The author is essentially asking you to become the property manager of your own life. If the resources aren't ultimately yours, the responsibility for permanently securing them isn't ultimately yours either.
Wow.
It places the burden of provision squarely on divine wisdom and guidance. Your daily job shifts from frantically trying to hoard wealth to secure my own unpredictable future, to faithfully and obediently managing whatever small amount I have been given today.
That is the entrance fee to this divine economy.
Yes, it is.
It is a radically different way to orient a human life. It flips the script on everything modern society teaches us about achieving financial independence through aggressive accumulation.
Absolutely.
We have gone on quite a philosophical journey with this source material today. I mean, we started in the very real, very paralyzing reality of modern financial crises, the crumbling giants, the crushing student debt, the vanishing retirements.
The epidemic of fear generated by asking temporary institutions to provide permanent safety.
Exactly. We followed the author's argument that this deep-seated fear is a natural, inevitable result of putting our ultimate trust in the temporary crowns of human government and flawed economic systems.
And finally, we explored this radical alternative, trusting in what the author frames as a divine economy.
Right, an alternative framework built on the promise of practical daily provision if individuals are willing to mentally surrender their ownership of resources to a higher power, trading their anxiety for stewardship.
And regardless of your personal belief system, this text serves as a powerful, unflinching mirror. It forces you to look at the architecture of your own life and ask, where are you currently anchoring your peace of mind? In a world that is demonstrably volatile, are you anchored to a Hollywood prop wall, a corporate slogan, or a fluctuating currency? Or are you anchored to something deeper that transcends the daily news cycle?
Which brings us right back to that tight feeling in your chest when you check your bank balance or read the latest economic headlines.
Right.
If worldly riches and human systems are inherently temporary, as that ancient proverb suggests, what does a truly recession-proof life actually look like?
It's a great question.
Could it be that true, unshakable financial security ultimately has very little to do with the amount of money you possess and everything to do with who you believe actually owns it? Something to mull over the next time you feel the solid ground start to slip.